All right, well, let's get started. Good afternoon, Atlanta. Good morning to our Seattle team of Amalia and Teresa. It certainly feels a little bit like Seattle today here in Atlanta with this weather being the way it is, but we're very glad to have this conversation with folks. We've started this process back in, I guess, April, and really kind of formally kicked it off in November. And we've heard from folks both that registered for this event and in our previous design workshop in November that they were curious about how a shared space worked. They weren't sure if they had seen a shared space before, and if there was a model here in North America. And the answer we felt, and one that the City Design Studio identified in prepping for their work and researching shared spaces, was Bell Street Park, which is located in Seattle. It was really a first of its kind in Seattle, and it has proven to be very successful. That is not only being applied to other streets in Seattle, it's used as a model in places like New York City. So kind of some lessons learned and applied here to Peachtree Street. Just a little bit of background about a shared space. It's basically looking at a holistic approach to the public realm. It really emphasizes the social elements of the space as much as it does mobility. It definitely puts people first. Many folks will say they've seen a shared space when in reality they have seen a pedestrian-only street or a transit-only street. But a shared space takes into account everyone, and it includes not only the streets, but also the intersections. And that's what makes a shared street space different than a shared street. While we were hoping to take you on a live tour of Bell Street, we also recognize that the weather in Seattle can be somewhat rainy this time of year, and a lot of times of year. So we went ahead and made the decision to film on what was a sunny day last week to take some video. A couple of housekeeping items. Everyone is on mute, but you have the ability to unmute. We would ask that you have any questions to save it to the end or when we ask for questions, or if you feel like it, to chat it in the chat box. With that, Megan, do you want to go to the next slide? So we will be taking a virtual tour. We'll have a little Q&A session, about 15 minutes at the end, and then we'll kind of identify some next steps that are happening this is the last event for today, but next week as we move on with our second workshop for Peachtree Shared Space. Next slide. With me today, we have Monique Forte. She is the project manager for this effort. She is working closely with Kevin Bacon, who is the director of design. Kevin and Monique really were the ones that started thinking about Peachtree Street differently, and Kevin's going to get into that in a moment. My name is Addie Weber. I am the project manager for the consultant team. I'm here in the Atlanta office, and I'm excited to introduce two of my colleagues in Seattle, Amalia and Teresa. Amalia is the engineer of record for Bell Street, and Teresa worked on the project as a landscape architect. They both bring experience having worked on stormwater issues and great streets in Seattle and other places. So we're really excited to hear from them. We're really excited they're on our team and that they woke up early and got ready for this meeting today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin or Monique. I'm not sure which one is going. Kevin.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Bacon. I am the Director of Design for the Department of City Planning. Very grateful that you all decided to spend your lunch with us today, even with some rainy weather outside, to really get the full virtual effect. A little bit of the history on this. This was a project that not just Monique and I started, but really a whole team of us have been working on for quite some time now. Actually, one of the very first projects that the Atlanta City Studio, that is a part of our Office of Design, took on back when we started in 2016. And it really started with this fundamental question you see here of how can we reimagine Peachtree Street as an exceptional design place for all people every day. It was coming out of this question I'm sure many of you all have kind of wrestled with before of Peachtree Street is our main street. It's the main street of our downtown. It runs all the way through Midtown and really even up through Buckhead and beyond. It's actually quite long when you really start to add it all up. But if you go out to it, it doesn't really have that main street feel. And I don't just mean certain architectural style or missing trees or anything like that, but just the vibrancy, the public life. You see it at things like, we used to see it at things like Dragon Con and the Peachtree Road Race and other festivals. But how do we get that kind of ambiance and that level of activity every day? And part of that is understanding that we've designed Peachtree a very certain way for cars and vehicles, and amidst the conversations of how do we add bike lanes, or at some point even scooter lanes, it was, well, how do we just design it for people, and really make it about the experience of downtown, and uphold it as a model of how we should be thinking about our public spaces throughout downtown and the rest of the city. Next slide. So, the studio's original work and this study really covers, more ground than is just here. We're really talking about North Avenue down to Marietta Street, kind of what we feel is a core of downtown, a good starting point. And then even, as we got into where would a shared space really for Peachtree work, certainly it changes character, conditions along those segments. And they all have kind of different needs and opportunities. But if we're talking about shared space design, a big redesign, a substantial public investment, where are the other pieces that already kind of exist that investment is kind of ready to be made? And our intuition was Peachtree Center, and as we've had our first workshops and engagement, that seems to have panned out, and people have agreed with that, and that's where we're starting to focus. On the next slide. And so we had some very early concepts of what that could look like. And you can see that here. This is from, I think, when we kind of concluded our first point of the work back in 2018. And there's an idea of how we change materials, have flush conditions, how we remove demarcations. And it was an idea. And so that's why we're at this study now of how do we really test the feasibility of that, really get into refining the design, looking at kind of real on the ground conditions beyond what we did in the kind of quickness of the studio work. Next slide. And a part of that is opening up the conversation again on what are the precedent examples that we looked at. There's a lot of great European examples, as there always are, and looking at some here at home, Bell Street being one of those. And one of the things that we've realized and we've talked about as a matter of this process too is that there's no kind of one singular way of approaching shared spaces. They all have kind of different degrees of sharedness, whether it's a shared space, a shared street. We talk about complete streets, and so starting to understand kind of have a better picture of how these kind of can be different and tend to operate, and not that we're copying any one example, but what are pieces that we can learn from and apply to Peachtree going forward. So we're really excited today to really pick up on one that going all the way back to the studio work we had focused on, which was Bell Street, one of the very first American examples to pick up, and a lot of people recognize this one as a model, and have somebody on our project team that has firsthand knowledge of it and share. It's always great to kind of really see places and learn from them. So we're excited to talk about that today, and glad that you all are here with us. And then I'm turning it back to Addie. Or am I going to Amalia? All right.
You're going to Amalia. You could take it to Seattle.
Then we're going straight to Seattle. So I will turn it over to Amalia and let her talk about her and Teresa's amazing work in Seattle.
Thanks so much, Kevin. So hello, everyone. My name is Amalia Layton-Cody. As Addie mentioned, I am in Seattle, and at the firm I worked at prior to joining Tool Design, we were the prime consultant on this project. And I was not the project manager, but I was the lead engineer of record. I stamped the drawings and led the process through the permitting and coordination with the city. And the reason that this project started was that this neighborhood, the Belltown neighborhood of Seattle, is one of the densest residential neighborhoods in the city. And for our comprehensive planning metrics, it lacked park space, and the cost of acquiring land or a parcel was too cost prohibitive. And so the community got together, identifying some existing policies. The city had a Green Street policy around, you can see in this photo, increased landscape area on some streets downtown, and Bell Street was one of them. And so they came together and they said, well, what if we actually make the street a park? And with that came additional funding and operations and maintenance challenges. But the community really coalesced around that. And there was some real opportunities about the location of this that we'll get into. But this image right here highlights that this was just a one-way downtown street. It had buses on it. It was a major access for fire. And this was a major pedestrian corridor, which we'll talk about in the next few slides. So there was back and angle parking. There's a range of land uses on the street. And so all of these considerations had to be taken into account as far as analysis of existing conditions. Removing a lot of these elements caused a lot of concern for some of the adjacent property owners. And so it was that balance of acknowledging needs of adjacent businesses, but also thinking about the community whole and the city as a whole of making this a better place. So this portion of Bell Street Boulevard, similar to what we're looking at here at Peachtree, is actually one portion of a longer corridor. The city has made a lot of investments and was planning to make a lot of investments in our waterfront. And Bell Street actually right now terminates down into a pier, which has a convention center to the west on Puget Sound. And then to the east, it actually connects down to South Lake Union, which is another area where, for example, we have a lot of Amazon, Google tech towers that are being constructed. So it's provided us a lot of opportunity to create open space through, you'll see some signs in some of the videos, something that the city is calling Market to Mohai, and basically it's a wayfinding effort to connect those two areas of the city. But these were the portions that were identified as the park. And you can see that they offer views and a really nice wayfinding, just experiential opportunity to move through our city. So again, the image on the left is the before and the image on the right was the after. And you can, there's still some construction photo fencing in those photos, but just the idea that it really changed the space. It was the way that people were able to interact with it. One of the key pieces of the street was programming it to allow for events and allow people to kind of use it as a front door for some of the residential and hotel uses that are on the street. Next slide. And carving just out spaces for people to enjoy. So this project went on for a long time. We were involved from 2009 through 2014 when the project was constructed, and the official opening and celebration and mayor pictures were in April of 2014. Next slide. So before we get into the videos, I want to set a little bit of the current context. We're going to show you some images of what it looked like after it was built for the few years and some of the really vibrant photos of plantings and programs that happened. But our videos from 2 weeks ago really are reflective of what's happening during the pandemic up here in Seattle. So you'll see that there's just less activity. People are using the space. They're really keeping their distance and doing things about kind of how people are interacting now, sitting down or walking. The city's actually closed these 4 blocks. Most of the park boulevards are closed. And as I mentioned, because this neighborhood does not have a lot of open space, they closed the street to provide more space for people to be active in the right of way. So you'll see some slides relating to Seattle Slow Streets Initiative, which programmatically citywide are closing streets for that activity. There's been a huge pandemic funding shift here in Seattle. So this park, and we'll get into this, is this 4 blocks are actually a joint maintenance between SDOT and Parks. They're 2 separate departments, and Parks funding was dramatically cut, despite the fact of people still using the parks. Not only was just their budget cuts, but their staffing was cut, so they just are not really, frankly, performing the maintenance that's needed on these blocks right now. And then just the housing and financial crisis, you'll see that there are some tents that are here. The city's doing a lot of things around homelessness, and while it wasn't a full encampment, there are some people, and they've set up effectively a honey bucket so that people have a safe place to wash their hands and go to the bathroom. So just keep that in mind as these are very current images that you'll see in some of the photos moving forward. Next slide. So in our, we've got a series of photos and videos, and we're going to cover these 5 topics. We're just going to talk about the basics of the corridor. We're going to get into some design details, and one might think, well, it's not necessarily the time to do that, but we don't have to get into the nitty gritty of the actual design. We want you guys to consider some of the details as you're moving forward to the concept, because as you'll see in our lessons learned, we wish we would have done that more. We spent a lot of time designing and thinking about intersections and transitions, particularly how it related to accessibility and ADA requirements. Stormwater management, when you remove a curb, you're effectively removing stormwater conveyance. So you have to think about protecting city property and adjacent properties from damage from stormwater. And then just some behind the scenes about operations and maintenance and programming that the city does on the corridor. Next slide. So we just, as Addie mentioned, we had the opportunity to go down town and take some images. And I think one of the things that that we want to highlight is that the street is shared, and the street is actually, there's a policy that removed the requirements, even when it's not closed for the Slow Streets initiative. Basically, you can't get a jaywalking ticket for walking across the street. It's identified as a pedestrian priority corridor. And so people were already biking and moving throughout the streets. It's a 1-lane traffic pattern going westbound. The city has chosen to reduce turning movements on it. And just by widening the sidewalks and narrowing the street, it's really changed the feel of the street and allowed the community to use this space, allowed the adjacent businesses to use the space. And that really helped with the buy-in of the project. There are instances where stores and restaurants had actually previously turned their backs on the corridor because of there was a lot of drug use on the corridor, that previously to this, it was not a well-lit corridor. And then just the investment in this really changed opportunity. You'll see various locations where the adjacent businesses have done sidewalk cafes. We spent a lot of time talking about, and we'll get into some more detail about this, bus movement, turning movements, accessibility, making sure that people that had visual impairments and were potentially using a cane to assist them in moving through the city were able to identify where the edge of the, effectively the edge of the sidewalk was, so that they knew that they didn't have to interact with vehicles. And we also looked at different ways to engage the community around the different plantings, art, wayfinding, and most importantly, lighting. There was a big shift to try to make this from a place that was really only safe during the day, and even that there was some concerns about personal safety that we heard from the community, to making it more of an 18-hour event to really have engaged the businesses and almost use it as a economic development driver for the corridor. And some of the buildings that you're going to see are boarded up because they are actually supposed to be renovated. And there's also, we have a very, our landmarks and historic building preservation laws also take time. And so one of the buildings that's boarded up is going through that process right now as well. So here you can see that currently there's a street close sign. And I think in closing, before we move on to some of the design details, where Teresa is going to join me and talk more about that, I did want to say that we don't actually, the city has used this, as Addie mentioned, as the baseline. This was really we didn't have design details around this. So we worked through a lot of design details. And as a result of this project, the city used this as the template to put into our Streets Illustrated or our right-of-way improvement manual, which Tool Design worked on, to use this as the template for other streets to change and to become shared spaces. And actually, Tool Design is working with the city on 2 other blocks just to the south of this to take closer to the Pike Place Market, to change streets to be curbless and to be more of a shared space on another corridor that connects our downtown retail area to the Pike Place Market and ultimately to the waterfront, where I mentioned the city is making a big investment. So again, we have a lot of lessons learned. We'll talk about that.
Right. I think we're good to get started again. Again, apologies to everyone, and hopefully this round will go a little bit smoother.
Thank you, Megan. This is Amalia again. Sorry, I had a little delay getting back on. So unfortunately, Teresa had to go, but I'll try to be a good representative of the landscape. So basically what she was trying to say was communicating the design details to the community were really important, and being able to interact with the adjacent property owners in a way to convey the level of detail we wanted to get their feedback on, particularly at the concept level, but being pretty accurate in our representations of things. And so she was mentioning that we chose to go down to the level of detail of CAD and really kind of look at the entrances, how the landscaping covering their signage, making sure they have access to their doors, just general movement and how they could benefit from this project. Next slide. So we wanted to show some pictures of what Bell Street looked like and how people interacted it pre-COVID. And so some of the screenshots that Megan's moving through just show how really transformational this project was for this space. Next slide. And so in contrast, this is what the project looks like now. But basically, some of the key things, particularly about the landscaping, was that, as I mentioned, that this was a parks facility, so Parks was going to maintain it. So in addition to just understanding the requirements about CPTED, community prevention, crime prevention through environmental design, thinking about visibility of pedestrians, particularly at the corners, and just maintenance and the type of vegetation, how fast it grows, when it would be blooming, working with the Parks Department and this Department of Transportation and the property owners were really critical for that process. And so we wanted to think about that really early on. The location of the planting areas were really driven, as I mentioned, by the utility locations, and this was really critical for the tree placement. The city actually, there were existing trees you saw in some of the before photos. The city chose to take down all of the trees and start over. There really wasn't enough soil volume for the trees, and so having these planting areas strategically placed allowed us to use structural soil underneath the pavement to provide more space for the projects. And you can see that there's different conditions around the planting strip where here there isn't a curb, so the effectively the sidewalk pavement just transitions right into the planting area, and the curbs are strategically located. Even though this is technically a curbless street because there's not one continuous curb, we were using curbs in strategic locations to help with some of the stormwater management, denoting where it was kind of mimicking some turning movements. You can see that this is an alley entrance, and providing some protection for the plants from vehicles and pedestrians. And frankly, for dogs. There's a lot of dogs in this neighborhood. One of the key land uses on this corridor is a dog park. And so just being mindful that there would be a lot of people walking and using this corridor for that. And so there was some fencing, and there was really a lot of thought about the types of plants and that they could really withstand some pretty harsh conditions through the corridor. The trees on the street have been really successful. We were able to have a mixture of species. We're thinking about resiliency, changing climate related to the type of species. And as I mentioned, the city at this time didn't use silvocels. And so instead we only use soil. We were able to do structural soil to increase the soil volume. But the city has now used this as an example and in other locations, and we're actually considering it for parts of the other project I mentioned that's south of this, is using silvocels to help with some of the soil volume and some of those conditions. Megan, let's move to the next, in the interest of time, let's move to the next video. So one of the other things that were really critical to this project were the intersections and how this project could transition. So this is a 4-block section, as I mentioned, of a longer corridor. And at the time of this project, the city actually had a moratorium where we were not allowed to do anything on the avenue. So that's the north-south streets. You can see that that person is crossing the avenue. So we basically weren't allowed to do anything to the pavement. We couldn't do anything other than channelization changes to the intersection. So we really had to think about how the street transitioned and how people were going to access the street and know that they were in a different space, whether they were a pedestrian, a cyclist, a bus, or a vehicle, and also loading and unloading. And so thinking about those transitions and the way that people move through the space was really important. At a basic level, we really needed to allow more space for pedestrians. We knew that this was going to be a higher capacity corridor with all the destinations along it. And having people be able to feel like they can safely cross. One of the things we analyzed was looking at scrambles so that all people could walk across the intersection at all times, but because of the traffic volumes on the avenues, that wasn't feasible to do at this time. So these intersections all operate where the pedestrians are moving directionally throughout the signal cycles. So one of the things that we looked at as a way to really transition the space is we changed the materials and we effectively used a driveway ramp to get people up into the site. And with that, we worked very closely with the bus operators and the fire truck operators to make sure that we weren't causing them any delays in their, or frankly, damage to their vehicles. Also, we really wanted to look at the crossing distances and minimizing the crossing distances and being really mindful about, especially when the street was open to vehicles and it was operating more as a shared space rather than when it was closed, that people knew where to cross and where there was a signal. And so we did use some very standard treatments as far as truncated domes for crossing to signalize that. And one of the things that on the avenues, there's 2 locations where there's protected bike facilities. So we also not only had to think about the vehicle and pedestrian interactions, but also the bicycle and pedestrian interactions. And the bike facility that you're seeing right here was actually retrofitted. It was actually installed about 3 years after the project was completed. And it actually, when you're out there, works pretty seamlessly. You don't really know now that those projects were detailed. So one of the things that we really wanted to think about was the opportunities in the future about extending this corridor, but also some of the projects that were going to happen on the avenues. I mentioned the bike lane, but there's also bus rapid transit on that. So you can see there's channelization that gives some predictability across the avenues, and then transitions back into a shared space. So those are all things to think about as well. And Tool Designs actually had the opportunity. We worked with FHWA on National Shared Streets Guidance, and we had an opportunity to go out with local residents from the blind, people in a wheelchair, and talk to them, kind of a forensic analysis, if you will, of the corridor. That was a very humbling experience for me as a designer, to kind of hear the things that we did successfully and that we could have done better. And one of the things that I think was a key takeaway, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the lessons learned, was we were really trying to narrow up crossings and narrow up the street. And so in doing that, because we didn't have a curb, we used tactile warning. The truncated domes were at the crossings, and then we did a more linear approach where we thought there would have been a curb. And what the main feedback that I want to share that we got is that especially people that were blind felt more exposed at those locations, that we'd actually put those tactile warning strips too close to where the cars were, and that really they wanted to use them instead of replacing a curb. They would have rather used them to help them travel directionally. So they recommended that we actually would have put the tactile directional strip within the sidewalk area, because they really just wanted to be able to follow it and know that they were going in a straight line and getting to the next intersection. Megan, let's stop there and go to the next video. So a lot of people ask about stormwater on Bell Street, and I mean, as you can see, there are some curbs. So it is still referred to as a curbless street because we're not maintaining a continuous curb line along the corridor. And actually, the curbs are for City of Seattle and non-standards are only 4 inches high. So stormwater was something that I would say that was not considered in the concept plan, like the visioning of this corridor, because they're really the existing utilities were really limiting. We were not literally able to put anything very far into the ground in a continuous way that would have helped us. There are some localized green stormwater infrastructure. So some of these planters are actually receiving runoff from the sidewalk and or the roadway. And there's bioretention soils to filter the water. And then there's an overflow structure in them to make sure that we're not causing any damage or flooding. You can see it right here. The other element that we did that was also non-standard that really helped is that, and this, we're still in discussions about this, about making it more of a standard design, but is using trench drains, similar to what you would do on a plaza. And that really allowed us to, you can see that there, that it allowed us to get the conveyance that we needed in the ground. And we basically used a trench drain that could withstand any loading from a fire truck, from a bus. This is something that airports use a lot to manage stormwater on their runways. And so this was a really important design consideration that we had to think about at the beginning of the project. So stormwater on a curbless street is very important because you need to be able to manage, and especially in, you know, people think Seattle, it drizzles a lot, but we've been getting very intense storm events here, probably more along the line of what you would see in Atlanta. And so that is a really important consideration to think about, like, where's that water going to go, and do you have the capacity to manage it? Next slide. So a couple of things that we just wanted to highlight before we open it up for questions is that you can see in the bottom left that there has been some pavement patching, and there was a lot of discussion when we talked about the materials of Bell Street. You can see that the street is concrete, and instead of trying to use more expensive materials, the city was really wanting to make sure that we kept to some of the standard pavement cross sections as much as possible, so that when there had to be improvements along the corridor in the future, that it was easier for either the city departments to do it or the adjacent development. And there actually has been some utility work for the signals. There's been some signal changes where we had the protected bike lane. And while you can, most people probably wouldn't notice it, but I notice it, that there's just some areas where the pavement's newer, but they were able to match the scoring line and the joint line because we were very detailed in some of the restoration requirements on this corridor. But even so, you can see there's patches that are have been put in that hopefully they'll come back and fix. The other thing I wanted to say is that the programming of this space, you can see we have a couple photos of events. The city wanted to give the community almost like a blanket permit so that it was easier for them to close the street for annual events, to really bring the community together in this space and have it act like a plaza. And so that was a huge component of the design. You can see that there's spaces for tents. There's a lot of people wanted to have Christmas lights up, or holiday lights up. You saw some of those photos. And so some of those fine details about how the space can be programmed, you know, do you want to add electrical outlets? Do you need to have water access for, you know, food trucks? All of those sorts of things were brought in, or for maintenance from the adjacent property owners or the community group. If you're going to allow for sidewalk cafes, what are the requirements about where people can put them? Seattle actually was, while we were working on this project, was working on liquor laws where people could actually cross the sidewalk and serve alcohol in a sidewalk cafe that was not adjacent to the building. That was something else that was brought up. So the kind of the programming and the use of this space, not only from the design consideration, but making sure that there's no legal barriers for the community to enjoy the space as they visioned, was really important. Next slide. So in closing, before we open it up to questions, I just want to highlight some of the things that were lessons learned. So we spent a lot of time on Bell Street talking about material versus maintenance, and it is a concrete street. And as I mentioned, the maintenance has been delayed this year, but that was really important. The durability of the materials, of the plantings, was really critical. We learned that simplicity leads to adaptability, that we don't need to design everything in as a permanent feature. We can let some of those things come and go as they need to respond to the community. One of the things is the community actually added more surface planters that they could move around, and they created little kind of pockets or zones to do different activities. And then also adapt to, just as I mentioned, the programming and leaving space for those events to occur. A key lesson learned was documenting and coordinating with departments and partner agencies. So as I mentioned, this was a key partnership between our Parks Department and our Transportation Department, but certainly the Planning Department, the Land Use Review, King County Metro, our Fire Department, they were all really critically involved, and we needed their buy-in and their feedback early on in the process. We also considered the potential for adjacent development, not only in the physical space, but how they would need to, if they needed to come in and do a water cut or add, connect to an electrical conduit. When we did this project, there was not a lot of guidance, even at the federal level from the Access Board, about shared streets or curbless streets and where to put placement and guidance on directional indicators. And there's been a lot more study about that. And so that's something that I think will be easier for you all to discuss, but just thinking about how to maximize comfort particularly when there's going to be cars. Even though it's a shared street, there are going to be people that just want to move through the space, and they're going to want to know that they want to effectively take the path of least resistance. And so really thinking about kind of a linear movement for people with all different types of abilities. And in closing, existing policy and code matters. There were some really fundamental things that we had to either document or tweak related to our existing code and create new code. And to be creative with it, one thing that turned out for this project is this street was not a park boulevard before. It was a city street, and Seattle has a network of Olmsted boulevards where the signage is different. And so the city actually chose, and this was related a lot to operations and maintenance as well, is to make this a park boulevard. And that really got into the funding of it and the way that the street could be used. And that opened up some opportunities for really making it more of a shared space than if it had just stayed as what would be, a standard roadway. So it's important to kind of think out of the box when you're thinking about potential barriers and turn them more into opportunities and opportunities for collaboration. So with that, I will end and see if there's any questions. And sorry, we went through a lot of those things fast, and hopefully I can provide some more information as needed.
Thanks, Amalia. And again, I want to apologize to the group on here for the bad actor. We sincerely apologize, and we are working with our IT to help prevent that, and the city as well, to help prevent that from happening at our next week's public meeting. So thank you everyone for being patient and bearing with us, and for those folks that still stayed on, we really appreciate it. Amalia, we have a lot of questions that are coming in. I'll start with the first one. This is from Ben. He says, I was actually interested to hear what happened when they didn't layer the utility features, utility and conduit in GIS. That was his last thought before we were sidetracked for a bit, but can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it was just frankly, that the initial team that did the visioning was not multidisciplinary. It was led by a landscape architecture firm and urban design firm that actually partnered with us on the final design. And they admitted that they just didn't think about it, that they just were looking at the traffic volumes, and the community was really interested in green infrastructure, but nobody bothered to turn on the utilities and understand that potentially a small line on a map is really a a 7 by 5 foot conduit of a major electrical line. So it's just, again, doing your due diligence and making sure you understand the parameters on all levels.
Great. So the next question comes from M. Anderson Bomar. You said there were bus operations on the streets. So how do they manage when you close the street for bigger events? I think that's getting to their question.
Yeah, so one of the things I want to say about Bell Street is that the bus was in operation. Since then, we've had our bus rapid transit has expanded, and so that bus line is not there anymore. Rather, the bus movements have been focused to the north and south avenues. But at the time, they just really, that was a factor in when they could close the street. So the bus service was reduced on the weekends, and so they were just able to reroute it to one of the other streets when it was the time. We have a lot of precedent for rerouting bus lines for especially in downtown with parades and events and those sorts of things. So there was just a designated alternative route with it, and they had temporary signage.
Great. Another question that came in from Caleb, is there a posted speed? In Georgia, I don't believe governments can post below 25 miles per hour except school zones.
Yeah, so that was something at the time that we did this project, the speed limit so this particular section of Bell Street was already classified as a non-arterial street. It already had a default speed limit of 25 miles an hour. The important piece is that while it was posted, we designed the street for a lot less. So all of our turning movements were designed for 5 miles an hour. We design, like the act of having them go up a ramp effectively or a driveway approach just made them stop and reduce the speed. So we didn't actually post a speed limit on this because frankly, the city doesn't enforce it. We just use design treatments. It was about our design speed. So a lot of our documentation noted that. And despite that, I did want to point out that the city still made us use a lot of obstruction marker signs, which made the urban designers and landscape architects so angry that they had these basically yellow and black trees everywhere. So we still did have to employ, even though we were designing a speed, we still had to put in elements for the 25 mile per hour, enforced, if you will, speed.
Great. Amalia, do you know how many, how much commercial square footage or hotel square footage is along the corridor?
I don't off the top of my head. There, you can see that there's a mix of high rise, 10-story buildings. I don't know off the top of my head, but if you will want to contact Addie, I can get you that information.
Great, thanks. All right, and we have several questions here from Nursef. So the first is, what was the traffic volume on the roadway before and what is it today?
So I would have to get back to you on what it is today. There's very little. And I'm not, so over time they have been adjusting, traffic operations has been adjusting the turning movements. So that has really impacted the traffic volume over time. And that was something that was agreed upon, that it was kind of going to be an evolution. I'd like to get back to you with the actual details on that, Nursef, and we can follow up with an email. But this was a 3-lane one-way street prior to it becoming a 1-lane one-way street.
And how long is Bell Street, including the intersections? I know it's 3 or 4 blocks, but do you know?
Oh, like the actual feet. So each block is about 300 feet. So it's about 1,500 feet.
Okay. The next question is, they saw a street closed sign. Is the street normally closed for events or daily, or is there kind of, I think you kind of addressed it before, but.
Yeah, so Seattle right now for the pandemic has responded by adding more space in the right of way. And so this is part of our slow streets network that's in response to the pandemic. Previously, it was more typically closed in the evenings or on the weekends for events. And it wouldn't even be the whole corridor. The street that was predominantly going to be closed was the street between 3rd and 4th. avenues. And so they weren't actually always going to close the entire 4-block section. That's the one that's adjacent to the dog park. And that space was really that particular block. Each block, we didn't get into the detail, but had a little bit of a different design element. One was considered the living room because there was more residential. One was considered like the stage. But this is getting outside of my my area of expertise. But the predominant block that was closed was one block between 3rd and 4th. So a lot of the event photos you see are from that block. And that's one where there's a park, there's a hotel on that block.
I believe you talked about this a little bit with the visually impaired and setting back the structure for that. But Nursif's question is, if there's no curb in place, wouldn't that impact the visually impaired? So I think just kind of hitting that home, I get with the guide strips a little bit more.
Yeah, so there were 2 things that we looked at, well, 3 actually. So one was the crossings and making sure we were still meeting ADA crossings. So that was like, where are we putting the, there's actually push buttons on some of the intersections. So all of those very detailed locational things, we still had to meet those at the intersections. One of the things that there was the least amount of guidance on, to your point, was, what do we have to do, if you will, along the roadway? And one thing that we knew we couldn't do is we couldn't use the truncated domes like we did at the intersection crossings, because at the time, those were not used in a linear pattern unless you were at a transit station. We spent a lot of time, we talked to people at the access board, we talked to local experts in this, we talked to the city's ADA coordinator. And so we ended up with, and I don't think you can see it in this background photo, but basically a non-standard directional strip. In addition to, we spent a lot of time looking at the differentiations in the pavement color, so that thinking about what people could see. And so we also did use curbs. The difference is our curb was just not continuous. And so the feedback that we got, well, generally, particularly with people with a cane, that there was just a lot of zigzagging for them because we didn't leave the curb in a linear fashion. And so what we heard from them is like they felt fine about their distance from it, but they just didn't have a consistent linear strip that if they were walking through the site, that they would have something. And so that was really good feedback, that they just wanted to be able to be efficient and walk straight and know where they were going. And so in retrospect, just having one single strip, similar to what you can see at some transit locations, and a lot of times you'll see that a lot of the European streets have that, where they're just directing people kind of in the path of travel that they want, that's the accessible path of travel, if you will.
I think this gets down to a question that we just had come in, and also Nursif's question. So I'm going to jump to one of them. It says, you mentioned that Bell Street is a residential street. Do you think such a shared roadway could be implemented on a commercial roadway with significant traffic volume? And Peachtree has about a little bit over 9,000 average daily trips on it.
So one thing this is not a residential street. It's just not an arterial downtown, but most people were treating it like an arterial. That's just the classification. So that just played into funding. We weren't allowed, it was harder for us to get state funding for this because it was a non-arterial street. So that's why it had to be local funding. And then the resident, I just wanted to point out that the land use is residential. So there's a mix, it's just a very mixed use, high density, commercial and residential adjacent land uses. So just to set that there. So there's lots of examples. And I think that, Nurse, if I just need to get you some numbers, because the other 2 streets that we're looking at, Pike and Pine, definitely also have had higher volumes, and those are considered an arterial street. And the city is choosing to close those down and make them a curbless street and really reduce them down to one travel lane. So I can follow up with that. I should have been prepared with that statistic, and I'm sorry that I didn't have that off the top of my head.
That's okay. And we have one more question, and then we'll close it up. It's last one from Nursif. Does Seattle, Washington State's motor vehicle law have restrictions about crossing locations such as intersections versus mid blocks? I know we have talked about that internally, but can you provide some feedback?
Yes. So there is state laws about that. The city can there is certain processes where the city can override that. There was precedent. There is a street at Pike Place Market that was already identified as effectively a pedestrian priority street. And I can send over that local code language. So that was applied to this in addition of making it a park boulevard. That also changed the requirements. And then of course, when the street is closed, all that went away. So when there was programmed events and street closure, the city has a long history of allowing street closures, permitted street closures for events. So all of those things combined, basically, but citywide, the city was also looking at eliminating jaywalking laws and people being able to be ticketed for jaywalking.
And one last question from Ben. He said, I noticed the delivery truck in the photo. You may have mentioned this before, but does Seattle have a curbside plan, and has the shared street helped or hindered delivery?
Yeah, so I can't say for certain if it has helped or hindered delivery, but we do have a curb space management plan. The curb space management was a huge part of that. We spent a lot of time discussing whether we actually had to paint effectively where the curb would have gone to indicate a load zone. At this point, they're just using signage. You can see there's no other pavement marking. Pavement markings was a huge discussion on the street, whether we were going to have, there was a group of people that wanted to stripe a separated bike facility. There was a group of people that wanted to stripe the curb line. And as you can see, we haven't gone down that path, and really because this was a pilot project, and we said paint is something you can always add later, but let's wait to see how this functions. Instead, we use pavement materials to delineate the roadway, and we use a lot of, there's signage and bollards and art in the landscape that identify some of those loading zones. And we didn't get to it, but unfortunately there was a video of like just a mail truck coming in and doing a delivery. There's also alleys on these streets, so there was already a precedent of doing some deliveries. Some of that utility is done in the alleys.
Great, thanks, Amalia. Thanks everybody for your questions. Kevin, Megan, I don't know if you can unmute Kevin to see if, or Monique, if they want to provide any additional words as we close out of here. But let's see, there's Kevin.
I'm back. And thank you for everybody that did rejoin us. We felt good about the security measures we have in place. Apparently we have some work to do, but we will be making sure we get to that before we regroup again for next week. I think my only closing thought on this, and coming from some of the questions, is, you know, we obviously appreciated Bell Street as a case study example for us when we were looking at Peachtree. We understand that there's a lot of differences between Bell Street, particularly the context in Seattle. So there are things that are similar. There are things that are different. There are lessons to be learned from that. It's again it's not like we're taking Bell Street, proposing that one for one it be plopped down into the middle of downtown Atlanta. But that's, you know, that's the point of case studies, is what is applicable, what is not, and where do we go from there. So very thankful that we had this opportunity with Amalia, despite the disruption, to come back and keep going through, because I think it was a very helpful presentation, and appreciated getting to really see it, not just through the glossy photos that always end up in the magazines, but you know, see it as it is today for all of its wear and tear, and just be real about it. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And as you see on your screen right now, the list of upcoming activities, we have the Great Streets Forum on Monday evening from 5 to 6:30. We've got 4 national speakers, including Amalia, coming in. For that, we'll have Tamika Butler, and with talking about equity, Emily Weidenhoff from NYC's DOT, speaking about transportation paradigm shifts, and Tara Green from Clyde Warren Park, speaking about activation and programming. Tuesday night, we're going to be talking about the demonstration project, bringing you up to speed on where that is landing. And then finally, on Wednesday, we have the community open studio. We'll get a sneak peek of where we are within the design and some of these questions that we are hearing today and how we would address that. We do have a Share Peachtree Sketch Challenge. So if there's an idea, you have a sketch, no matter how good or bad, please sketch it out. Send it to peachtree@atlantagA.gov, and we will tag it as we move forward. With that, we hope everybody joins, has a great Friday, and we will speak to you soon. And thank you so much for sticking with us. Bye.
Thank you.